Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen in on a conversation between Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and David Adesnik and John Hanna, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. They're discussing Adesnik and Hanna's recent work entitled From Trump to Biden, The Way Ahead for United States National Security. The authors in the report covered the panoply of range of issues in the United States security space, from Russia to China to North Korea, Turkey, as well as responses to COVID and to climate change. Inboden and the authors highlight the places in which they feel the Trump administration did have some success, as well as highlighting areas where the Trump administration's policies were deficient. The discussion serves to shine a light on areas where there are opportunities for bipartisan consensus in foreign policy going forward. Let's listen in.
All right. Hello to all of our Horns of a Dilemma listeners. I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our latest episode. And I'm honored to be joined today by two longtime friends of mine, David Adesnik and John Hanna, both with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which most of our listeners will know is really one of Washington's premier and most influential think tanks. David and John are the co-editors of a new report called From Trump to Biden, The Way Forward for United States National Security. And it's a very carefully researched and analyzed assessment of the last 4 years of the Trump administration's foreign and defense policies, and then suggestions on the way forward for the Biden administration. I want to say on a personal note, it's especially fun for me to be having this conversation with David and John, since they're both longtime personal friends of mine. David, I first met when we were both students of John Lewis Gaddis back at Yale. So it's been great to see David's policy career flourish so much since then. And John, I had the honor of working with in the Bush administration on the National Security Council staff when John was the National Security Advisor for Vice President Cheney. So, gentlemen, it's great to have both of you here.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
For our listeners, obviously, this has been one of the most troubled and tumultuous presidential transitions, probably the most tumultuous and troubled presidential transition in American history. And amidst our horror and revulsion at Trump's efforts to overturn the election, there's also a 4-year record of foreign policy to evaluate. And this really matters, especially as the Biden administration prepares to take power and assess the policies that they inherit. What ones worked, what didn't, what's worth preserving, what needs modifying, what should perhaps be changed outright. And I think this new FDD report is really one of the best roadmaps that the Biden team can take up. So I know that they're going to be having flooded inboxes really from day one, but I hope they can. Our friends in the Biden administration can make time to read this. I want to begin by reading a couple excerpts from the report's introduction, and then we're going to hear much more from David and John on a number of the highlights. But just for our listeners, I think the introduction really frames the overall tenor and themes of the report well and strikes a very important balance. As Trump's presidency ends, his shortcomings as the leader of the world's most powerful liberal democracy are starker than ever. The insults flung at long-standing Democratic allies, the flattery of tyrants, the questioning of solemn treaty commitments, an oftentimes shambolic decision-making process marked by confusion, flip-flops, and deep contradictions between Trump and his advisors. The list goes on. And all of it magnified in the final months of his presidency by Trump's unprecedented refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of his successor, President-elect Joe Biden, his extended quest to overturn the results of a Democratic election, and the shocking spectacle of a pro-Trump mob storming the U.S. Capitol as Congress assembled to fulfill its constitutionally mandated duty to certify Biden's status as the nation's next commander-in-chief. Continuing on in the introduction, the authors pull no punches in areas where they judge Trump's efforts to have fallen short or even failed. But the authors also find many instances in which his initiatives had real merit in terms of advancing important American interests and are worthy of being maintained or built upon by the Biden administration. Pointing out where the Trump administration may have succeeded in no way mitigates Trump's incitement of an insurrection against our constitutional order. Rather, it's an effort to point out what can be salvaged as Biden seeks to repair the damage done at home and abroad. So anyway, that was the introduction, or part of the introduction of the report, which I really think frames things well and gives our listeners the context they'll need to appreciate this and fully digest the report. David and John, can one or both of you first just tell us briefly about the process by which you went about assembling this report. Who are the authors that you enlisted? How did you decide what topics to include, what ones not to include? How was the research and analysis done?
Sure. In a way, the story here actually goes back 2 years ago. We first did a midterm assessment of the Trump administration that came out right after the new Congress was seated in January 2019. And the form was similar. It was a collection of essays on about 24 topics, utilizing the expertise of our colleagues at FDD and some friends of FDD. And, the vision then, it was obviously the same administration saying, but we wanted, very specific advice. So we began with what we hoped would be a neutral, balanced overview of the policy in the first 2 years, an assessment where authors gave their opinions and concluded with the bullet points on what to do next. And, we think that got a pretty positive response. We felt it would be worth doing once again, with a slightly different challenge, of course, is that, we didn't know what the outcome of the election would be when we started on this project in the summer. So we mostly put together the historical material and then had to wait a bit on the recommendations. And of course, we corralled the same herd of cats as before. And we got them then to react quickly after the election, finalize recommendations. And everything was just about ready to go when January 6th happened. But that's the process. John and I have really worked sort of hand in glove, editing just about every chapter.
Okay, great. John, anything to add on that, or any particular authors to highlight? Or
No, I mean, it's a terrific group. It includes, an unbelievable range of FDD talent. I mean, that in part is part of the reason for doing this, just because we have so much in-house expertise that covers really the waterfront of issues. I think the one issue that we don't really aren't able to get into, simply because we don't have the expertise, was climate change, which is obviously a very hot and big topic and will be for the Biden administration. But otherwise, I think this is a pretty comprehensive and systematic effort. And I think when people read it, we've really structured each chapter to be about a 1,500-word essay, each of them broken up in a very structured way into 3 parts: an assessment of what the Trump administration, of what its policy was, the good and the bad of that policy, and then going forward recommendations for the next administration. So people are going to be able to go through the table of contents, choose their subject of greatest interest and focus just on that, or they're going to be able to get a very comprehensive and systematic view of U.S. foreign policy by reading the entire volume. But either way, I think it's a very digestible and user-friendly kind of product that I think people thinking about U.S. foreign policy will find useful and thought-provoking.
Terrific, and I definitely want to echo the affirmations on the in-house talent at FDD. I still, vivid memory of meeting with Cliff May many years ago when he was first launching FDD, and thinking, this sounds like an interesting new idea. Will it be, let's see if this thing's going to fly or not. And my goodness, to look at what in a relatively short time FDD has become as far as one of Washington's most influential foreign policy think tanks is really something. So again, a great showcase of the talent, but also, as you said, user friendly. So listeners don't feel like you have to read the entire report. You can flip ahead to the chapter of particular interest to you, whether it's on Iran or Russia or something else. All right, let's get now into the substance of the report. I want to first ask a kind of a conceptual framing question, which is about America first, right? I mean, one thing scholars and pundits often do with each presidential administration is identify what is the doctrine here. What was the Bush doctrine? What was the Obama doctrine? What was the Reagan doctrine? And there's been a lot of ink spilled on this question of what is or was the Trump doctrine. We don't necessarily have to answer that precisely, but no one can really talk about the Trump doctrine without this concept of America first. Of course, both of you as scholars and practitioners know that the historical resonances of America first are, pretty disquieting in terms of, the late 1930s movement and the anti-Semitism and isolationism associated with it. And yet, as the report's introduction describes, trying to give a more balanced assessment of what the Trump administration meant by it was, you call it a blend of populism, nationalism, mercantilism, isolationism, and unilateralism. This maxim helped explain his transactional view of alliances, lack of attention to human rights, and skepticism of free trade deals and foreign military commitments. And then you describe some of the mixed results there. But going forward, has America first in some ways been redefined? Have we, has the Trump administration been able to put behind it the previous iteration of it from the 1930s? and now created a new concept of America First, which people can agree with or disagree with, or maybe affirm in part or disagree with in part. But is this just now going to be a shorthand for nationalist populism, and is it a helpful bumper sticker summation, if you will, of the Trump doctrine?
I think it is with some limits. You read off our list of nationalism, populism, mercantilism, unilateralism, isolationism. There's a lot of contradictions in there. It's hard to distill something entirely coherent from that. I'd also say, Trump, sometimes with justification, touted his unpredictability as a virtue. And there are times when unpredictability is, I think, the preferred view. Generals often say this, I think, in testimony. We'd prefer to be strategically predictable and operationally unpredictable. I think with Trump, it went across the board. And then also, in some ways, it went even deeper than that because, what we saw on January 6th was, was it America first? What we saw was it was Trump first and above all else. It was interesting. So the past 11 days or 12 days, actually, Mike Pompeo each day has tweeted the same image from his Twitter account, which is a stock photo of Americans waving the flag with the words America First emblazoned over it in what looks to be about 72-point type. And it's actually one of the most popular of his tweets. It got 100,000 plus likes yesterday. He doesn't define it a lot, but briefly on the first day, he said, "What is America First?" He said it's realism, restraint, and respect for the founding. And I think that's interesting because there has been an intellectual effort for the past 4 years by Michael Anton and others to explain and justify what really makes America First compelling, why it's not a retread of the isolationism we want to reject. And at the same time, what we saw on January 6th, none of those words could really apply. I mean, it was unrealism to the nth degree based on conspiracy theories, a complete lack of restraint, obviously, and, attacking the Congress is anything but respect for the founding. So what happened recently is going to change our perspective. But I do think, and we could go into it more in the details, there was a sort of a thread that went through, but with contradictions at many points where you could say that's not America First, both for good and for ill.
Whatever the historical resonances of America First, I do think you're onto something, that it has sort of redefined the term to mean a more nationalist, populist approach to foreign policy that, at least in theory, is supposed to operate on one central question always being asked of American foreign policy: is what we're doing actually serving the needs and interests of the American people in prosperity and security and likewise? And I think that meaning of it had enormous resonance in 2016 with a large segment of the population that, again, whether we agree with it or not, I think we as foreign policy specialists have to take account of it, that there was a significant portion of the American population that felt they had not been well served by something called the liberal international rules-based international order, that free trade agreements and the offshoring of manufacturing overseas, that wars fought in places like Afghanistan and Iraq that seemed to go on forever, that it was the American people that had taken the brunt of those, and these policies made in Washington were just no longer working for them. And I think Trump hit on that, and he exploited it to the nth degree. And I just note that it's very interesting, as much as the president-elect Joe Biden wants to set himself in opposition to Trumpism, it was interesting to me that his designate for national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, was a principal participant in a study that was recently conducted, a 2-year-long study entitled "Making American Foreign Policy Work for the Middle Class." And I think that effort, and the effort that's going to need to be made, and the sensitivity shown by the American foreign policy establishment to that, to just asking that first order kind of question of how are we serving the interests through our policies of the American people, that everybody's going to be, I think, more acutely sensitive to that. And to that degree, whether we admit it or not, to some extent, we're all Trumpists in that regard, in that we've been forced to ask that first order question. And I think at some level we should be, that it's an important corrective that we ignore at our own peril.
Very good points, John, about how meanings can evolve and how there can be perhaps some controversy associated with a particular term, but the concepts behind it can create a new reality. And in that sense, I think you're right. You're perhaps in that way, we're all America firsters now, one way or another. And we've seen that even with a couple of the Biden transition team's announcements in economic policy. This is paraphrasing, but the same things. We're going to be putting American interests first, putting the American people first, right? America first. And on a reminder of how words and concepts can evolve or change in their meaning. One of my favorite scholarly articles by Paul Kennedy points out how the word appeasement was actually a good word. It was seen as an achievement, a positive thing up until Munich in 1938. Appeasement up until then was seen as a diplomatic success. That's how you come to a peaceful solution and remedy what otherwise could be a conflict. But of course now appeasement is almost always a bad word. And so maybe America first has gone from being a little more toxic to now a little bit more of just an acceptable statement of fact. Your comment there is a good pivot to my next question, which is, what would you two, as the co-editors of the report, or kind of the top line summaries, what do you regard as some of the biggest successes of Trump administration foreign policy that did well for America, and that potentially you would certainly encourage the Biden administration to adopt and embrace?
Well, I mean, David will add on here. I think some of the things that we talk about actually in an introductory chapter that we try to highlight. First of all, I must say that, and Will, you'll appreciate this as a former strategic planner, that I was quite impressed by the documents that the Trump administration national security team put out at the end of 2017. H.R. McMaster and Nadia Shadlow helped co-author the National Security Strategy, and that was followed quickly by Jim Mattis's National Defense Strategy. And if you actually look at the amount of discussion those documents got, they ended up being very important texts. And I think they did have a very influential role, both on the thinking of the broader foreign policy community, but also on the administration itself, in giving it a direction and giving it a North Star, which was essentially the concept of the return of great power competition, particularly between the United States and China. And I think that was meaningful. And I think the paradigm shift that was affected with regard to China, moving it from, a generation of people thinking about how do we integrate it into the rules-based international order as a responsible stakeholder, to viewing it really as a strategic competitor and probably the greatest threat to the American-led order that we've had since the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in some ways a much greater challenge. That is perhaps the most important shift that the Trump administration brought about. Now, was it executed perfectly? Absolutely not. But is it a basis upon which a Biden administration and Democrats and Republicans alike can come together in some level of bipartisan consensus on what should be the priority for American foreign policy going forward? I think absolutely yes. It is in a political environment that is riven by intensifying polarization and division, all culminating in the awful events of January 6th. China and the threat of China and the challenge of China, and how do you deal with this rising power without either blowing up the world or impoverishing the world, and yet defending this American-based international order that served us so well for more than 70 years, really is a central challenge of our time that I think Americans from both sides of the aisle can get together and build a more bipartisan approach to foreign policy on. And so I think that's one thing that we stress, but there are several others that David might want to jump in on.
Sure, and I'll just begin with a bit of elaboration on the China point, because of the three, and the two I want to highlight in addition have to do with the Abraham Accords between Israel and some of the Arab states, and then the additional leverage we have vis-a-vis Iran. So it'll be the easiest in some ways to get that any bipartisan acceptance for the first one regarding China. Looking back now, it's almost hard to imagine that there were people who wanted to sort of stay with the older responsible stakeholder approach. That it seems everyone is on board now. I think what's happened with the Uyghurs and in part with Hong Kong, the human rights violations are so profound and widespread that it's much easier to get on board from the left on a tough on China policy, not to mention for economic reasons. And you've seen that evolution. It's hard to recall, but in the previous national security strategy, the second one the Obama administration put out, they touted how much they were cooperating with China. There were signs that they weren't totally naive. They understood what was happening. They talked about a pivot to Asia, but the hesitant nature of the document to describe China as a threat or an adversary or great power competition, that was off the table. That was still taboo when Obama put that second strategy out, and now it isn't. And I think importantly, you could see it as an article. I believe it was in Foreign Affairs, Jake Sullivan with Kurt Campbell, another senior Asia hand who's likely to be back in this administration. They say very candidly, and this shows you the depth of the consensus, the previous view was wrong. We have learned there was an element of fundamentally misguided thinking when it comes to believing we could simply extend a hand to China and have it join us in this order, or that economic growth would bring it in on the political front. So that's what's most promising. I think there is potential for bipartisan appeal on the Abraham Accords, the normalization between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, and what looks to be the incipient normalization with Morocco and with Sudan. And there, I think just because peace or additional comedy in the Middle East is something America has wanted for so long, there'll be a desire to build on that. I think Biden sort of has a feel in his bones for it, but there is also a progressive backlash against it. Obviously one view is that this is at the expense of the Palestinians. There's a view that says that still remains the fundamental issue in Israel's relations with its neighbors, and this is a dodge. And a second point, which I find less credible, is that they say, Israel's making peace with repressive dictatorships, and that's what it's really about. That one is the one I would dismiss more easily, right? Of course, everyone celebrated peace with Egypt and peace with Jordan, even though those were very much the same. And the demand to negotiate with the Palestinians is, of course, a demand to negotiate with the autocrat who runs the Palestinian Authority in year 14 or 15 of his 4-year elected term. But, the other point is this good or bad in terms of addressing that Palestinian issue, which is a live one? And, the optimistic take, and I hope we see this, is that the Palestinians, Abbas, to the extent he was interested in negotiations, certainly Hamas, they wanted to continually leverage the fact that the rest of the Arab world would still treat Israel as a pariah, regardless of how much the obstructionism was coming from the other side. And this broke that. And this said, other states, we can treat Israel as a state with a problem. We look at all the other states in the Arab world, and many of them have problems. Some, like Syria, are pretty much genocidal states. And yet they're not sort of drummed out of the international order. So I would hope that what happens is this induces to some degree a new realism and a positive pressure from the Gulf states for a reasonable solution. And then the third one, the hardest is going to be the Iran issue. That is where, obviously there was a big partisan division. It was not a perfect partisan alignment over the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. It was basically Republicans lining up completely in partisan ranks with a handful of Democrats coming over as well in opposition. But I'd say that mostly the Democratic foreign policy establishment, those in the Obama administration that put together the deal, remain very avid defenders of it. And many of them reject the idea that any of the leverage that comes with a very tight sanctions regime and other forms of diplomatic and quasi-military pressure, such as the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, are good things. They say the number one important thing is just to get back in that deal. Biden's official line is, we'll get back in the deal, which means lifting almost all those sanctions. And then we'll try to move on to another deal that acknowledges some of the flaws we have. Our big point is that's just not realistic. If you give up all your leverage just to get back to the first deal, you're not going to get to a second better deal, which Iran has no reason to concede.
David, I'm especially glad you brought up the Iran point, because again, I want to highlight for our listeners, many of whom hopefully already know this, that FDD houses perhaps the single biggest incubator of expertise on Iran and financial sanctions policy in Washington. So when FDD speaks on Iran, people listen, or people should listen.
And Will, I just on that point, if people go to the Iran chapter and read what the two of the most important innovators on Iran sanctions policy in Washington, Rich Goldberg and Mark Dubowitz, have co-authored that chapter. And if you go to the list of recommendations, it's just amazing in its granularity and its creativity about, you think we're doing maximum pressure now. Here's what else is still on the table that a Biden administration could draw on if it needs to build further leverage and pressure.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see where the Biden administration goes on that. And John, back to a point you were making that David picked up on, which I think can link these two, is China and the strategic reevaluation, or almost a strategic paradigm shift that has taken place there on China. I think is very notable. And as you cited, some leaders, leading voices, leading policy leaders in the Biden administration, such as Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell, I think we could add Tony Blinken to that list, have over the last year been on record as saying that, previous strategic assumptions about China, we got wrong. We as a country, they as policymakers, I'm not pointing any fingers here, I'm on record as saying I got a lot of strategic assumptions about China wrong. And so I think it's notable that senior policymakers are willing to do such a rethink of policies that they had previously embraced. It'll be interesting to see if they do a similar rethink on Iran policy. Thus far, there's been less indications of that, but hey, we will see. The historian in me knows that it's historical malpractice to try to make present-day pronouncements on how things will be looked at in history. That said, let me try anyway. I have been reflecting that the strategic paradigm shift that took place in the American policy community on China really just between 2015 and 2017 almost. You can date it between, the later years of the Obama administration, still, as you said, the governing paradigm being let's look for areas of cooperation, to now by 2017, the Trump NSS saying it is a strategic competition. China's our primary adversary. That's a breathtakingly rapid strategic reassessment to take place. And that was also taking place among a lot of Democrats. So it's not just a partisan thing. I've wondered if historians will look back on that and find it comparable to the similarly rapid strategic reassessment that took place between 1945 and 47 in the Soviet Union. And remember, up till the end of the Second World War, the Soviets were still our formal allies in the war, and for good reasons. We had to defeat the Nazis and then Imperial Japan. But within 2 years, by 1947, and not just because of George Kennan's long telegram, there's an entire reassessment in the American strategic community, realizing, hey, we had good reasons to cooperate with the Soviets before, but now they are our fundamental adversary, and we seem to be coming, pretty quickly, or have come to a similar point with China. So, for our listeners, one clue to look for is once the Biden administration releases its first national security strategy, hopefully by the end of this year. But it'll be interesting to lay that alongside the Trump one and do almost a paragraph by paragraph comparison and see where they're similar, where they're different. So, all right, back to your report. You've given us a great top line overview of what you see as some of the Trump administration's main successes. Any other successes you want to highlight before we move on to other stuff? Any perhaps less well-known policies that they had that you nonetheless think are worthy of accolades and perhaps emulation?
One that comes to mind that I don't think people talk enough about, and it may have some downsides to it, but I think is overwhelmingly positive, is the continued progress in the relationship with India, in developing that strategic relationship, in deepening and expanding military cooperation with India, in trying to again build out and solidify this coalition of quadrilateral between India, the United States, Japan, and Australia in the Indo-Pacific, obviously as part of this effort to begin balancing and pushing back against China. That I think the relationship made great strides, that the Trump administration focused on it. They invested in it, including personally at the relationship of Modi and President Trump, as well as cabinet level officers. They didn't invent it. It obviously has been something that U.S. officials have been thinking about and working on for a long time. But I think a whole confluence of factors, as well as the administration's efforts, allowed us to do that. And I think that's an important part of this overall strategic puzzle of how it is we're going to go forward and compete successfully against the rise of China.
Great. Yeah, no, India will certainly be an important part of that. David?
Yeah, I wanted to go in with, 1.5 more achievements. So the one is we did actually have some substantial increases in defense spending for the first time in quite a while. That The details are complicated of how Congress appropriates, but basically from around 2010, 2011 to the end of the Obama administration, we were under the cloud of something that was somewhat misleadingly known as sequestration, but for a variety of reasons, it was a pretty hard cap on getting us near the defense spending we needed. Obama's people, testified we need this to be higher, but for them, they wouldn't go higher unless the Republicans went higher on domestic spending. And with the advantages the Trump administration had in Congress, it didn't have to offer up that compromise as much, or to some degree, more recently, there's been a ton of domestic spending anyhow. So we saw something, I think it was 8% real growth in 1 year. I think that was for 2018. We didn't necessarily keep getting what we needed. Mattis had said we needed 3 to 5% real growth continuing year after year. We're not going to hit that. But just as a down payment, at least, especially considering the ramped up strategic competition. And China is certainly not all about the military side. It is a military threat. Our chapter on China by our team emphasizes how much it's about standard settings, about economics, about intellectual property theft, about many other things. And one of them is competition in international organizations. And that's sort of the half victory. I think to some degree, this administration was most willing to break eggs and do things that were previously taboo, pulling out of the Human Rights Council. A number of the moves were in some ways more oriented toward the administration's agenda on Israel. And of course, their moves against the World Health Organization had a lot to do with the domestic politics of COVID. But across the board, there began to be sort of a moving away from the sacrosanct status of a lot of international organizations within the UN family or related. But it didn't culminate in either a concerted strategy to push back against Chinese influence, because there's a growing realization that China is waging a concerted campaign. It's doing its best to manipulate these organizations. It's not a principled actor eager to participate. It's in one that wants to co-opt so that it can break the rules when it wants to. So we didn't either get to the reforms of those organizations or a strategy, and that's going to be a big one for Biden. And I think partly it's hard to read how much his team recognizes that they can treat international organizations as a field for competition rather than an area where we simply return to them as good faith participants, and that's enough to advance world order. So if there's one of the biggest points I would say to them, when you come back with all the credibility you're going to have as the post-Trump American administration with 81 million votes, with a record of being good on alliances, of knowing you want to extend a hand, don't just, as Biden said, say America is back and appear. You have to say, look, there are things we need to make this work. It's not just that we can flip the switch back to the pre-Trump, pre-China competition era. You have to help us with these reforms, and they're going to have to push hard. It won't always be comfortable.
Yeah, and I think the WHO is a good example there. How the WHO's early on almost supine posture and compromises and missteps on COVID, revealed how this is a case of almost regulatory capture by China, right, of this multilateral organization. But I think revealed to people across the political spectrum some of the pretty profound structural deficiencies and problems there with the WHO. Now, that does not necessarily mean withdraw is the answer, and I know that's not the forthcoming Biden administration's policy, but perhaps can show areas where American engagement in these institutions should not have come at the expense of pushing for reform.
Yeah, a lot of it. We need concerted efforts when there are elections to make sure that a pro rule of law sort of candidate, someone that really will uphold Western norms, is someone who gets put in the top slot, as opposed to someone, because that is why we have the current leader of the WHO. He was very much someone that China pushed over a British candidate. And across the board, we're going to need that. In other cases, it's more coalition based. It's not so much about selecting the rotating leadership, but about having enough democratic and democratic aligned nations ready to stand up.
Back to your report, let's turn to the negative side of the ledger. Tell us the highlights of in your report, what you thought were your biggest criticisms of Trump administration foreign policy, or the deficiencies, or the areas where you will encourage the Biden administration to scrap them or pivot away.
Well, I think they already know some of the areas they clearly want to scrap. And some of it is, if you divide it to some degree between rhetoric and policy, the undoing is easiest for rhetoric, right? And rhetoric has consequences. So, I mean, that's an ongoing debate among both scholars and practitioners. But certainly, right, Trump lavished praise on a lot of the most odious dictators. Even while competing with China, he was praising Xi. When he seemed to be getting his way with North Korea, he talked about falling in love with Kim Jong-un. He had praise for Erdogan, he had praise for Putin, he had praise for Duterte. I don't even think I could complete the list.
Mohammed bin Salman, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's one of the biggest. Our John Hanna here was the co-author of the Saudi chapter, and he can, lay into Trump quite a bit for the excesses there. And that can stop, and I hope it stops. I think what may be harder for the Biden team to recognize is when it comes to actually trying to confront some of those states, there is always this other impulse. You could label it as the realist or realpolitik impulse. Well, we still don't want bad relations. We don't want to provoke them. And if you continue to talk about the importance of norms and values, that's going to be hard. People are going to want other things with China. It looks like John Kerry is set to try to make climate change the pivotal point and to try to get them to concede anything. The answer has been, and it was in previous, often Democratic and Republican administrations, be quiet on human rights. Don't poke that in their eye. We know how sensitive they are. The reason they invest hundreds of billions in domestic surveillance and oppression is because they're so sensitive about their own lack of legitimacy. And if Biden is talking a lot about democracy, it's a pretty amazing turn considering the way that democracy promotion was almost a taboo, that after what George W. Bush said, many aspects of it I supported. It had its shortcomings as well. We can get into that. But the point is it had a partisan valence. There was no question if you talk democracy promotion, it was somehow suggesting approval of George W. Bush. Biden has totally turned that around, but I hope he and his advisors are ready to realize it's not easy. So just some of the other failures quickly, I think to some degree, just the pulling out of just about any organization or treaty. I think, again, they're going to have to be judicious. There are times Trump simply went too far. I think with the WHO, we just talked about it. He was looking for a scapegoat to deflect attention from his own problems with COVID. On other organizations, it seemed better, right? The Russians just weren't going to get in line and observe the terms of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So I think there was a case for pulling out. But in general, this was sort of to some degree, a default push for everything with Trump, which is just, take your ball and go home rather than playing on multilateralism. They're going to change that. On trade, it'll be interesting. And Trump thundered a lot, but then sort of walked it back, whether it's on having, NAFTA 2.0 instead of NAFTA, whether it's on the phase one agreement with China. And then, of course, some of the biggest failures are ones that are sort of sui generis, right? Obviously, Trump going to Ukraine and basically leveraging U.S. aid to try to elicit a sort of a black eye for Biden in the upcoming campaign. They know that's wrong, and I think they know not to do it again. I mean, Trump's own people, whether it's John Bolton calling it a drug deal he wanted no part of, understood that was way outside the bounds. And probably less well known, but also disturbing, is say what Trump, the actual favors, not just rhetoric for Erdogan. Whether it's pulling U.S. troops away from the border between Syria and Turkey, letting Turkey invade and commit a lot of atrocities, interfering in the U.S. justice system so that Turkish banks complicit in sanctions evasion got off the hook. There's plenty of bad to undo, and I think most of those things Biden is entirely on board with undoing. If there's an exception, Afghanistan, a bad deal with the Taliban was really, we think, a black eye for the administration, and actually that's one where Biden is most likely set to continue a pretty similar policy.
John, anything to add on this, on the more critical assessments of where the Trump administration may have gotten things wrong?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would add to David's very comprehensive list would just be the general question of the treatment of longstanding Democratic allies. Our most powerful liberal, democratic, capitalist, market-based economies, particularly in Europe, but to some extent in South Korea and Japan as well. I think the extreme excessive transactionalism of Trump, even in the face of his administration recognizing China as this great threat and priority for American national security policy, picking fights endlessly on trade issues or burden sharing issues, insulting leaders in a way that was completely gratuitous and unnecessary. Questioning NATO and the Central Article 5 treaty commitments to come to the defense if one of the allies is attacked. I think all of that did damage. It was not helpful. It hindered U.S. policy to do what Trump administration wanted to do, and as laid out in the national security strategy. And that's obviously one thing, the rebuilding of the trust and confidence and credibility of American leadership with those allies, to muster and mobilize all of that very consequential power and real strategic advantage that America has that neither the Russians nor Chinese can compete with or duplicate in terms of our alliances with very, very powerful countries. I think that's one place where Biden is very much focused on that I think is completely legitimate, to rebuild those alliances with those allies that we've been working with since the end of World War II and have served us again enormously well. Do they need reform? Do they need adjustment? Absolutely. But I think Trump's approach of occasionally taking a wrecking ball to them was really quite counterproductive.
Yeah, as I've in print and when I've done speaking engagements before, often try to remind audiences about the value of allies is it's not just about the dollars and cents that they may be contributing to their defense budgets, although that matters. That matters a lot. But over 1,000 non-American NATO soldiers have died in combat in Afghanistan, right? And it wasn't other NATO countries attacked on 9/11. It was America. And so if we're adding up the value of allies and alliances, let's also remember that our allies have over 1,000 of their soldiers have paid the ultimate price. And I do think that the Biden team certainly appreciates that value quotient too. All right, guys, just a couple more questions because I know we're coming up on the end of our time here. And again, I've been remiss. I should have reminded our listeners earlier. The report can be found at the FDD website, which is fdd.org. So we'll encourage all of our listeners to download it there as soon as it's available. Let me just toss out three countries that have come up in some ways in passing, but I just want to get your kind of top line conclusions from the report. North Korea, Russia, and Turkey. All pretty important. I know the report has chapters on those. Any big highlights you want to share on your evaluation of Trump policies on North Korea, Turkey, and Russia?
Well, why don't I maybe just start in the order you did, and I'll leave Russia to John Hanna, since he actually has some pretty impressive background there. So with North Korea, we saw what seemed to be promising at the start. Trump's, famous fire and fury rhetoric got people a little on edge, but then there seemed to be an openness from Kim Jong-un to negotiating something. There was these two historic summits. We thought there was potential for Trump to have a breakthrough there, but then I think in part he didn't recognize what was necessary. I think the core point that he didn't see to what extent the promise of denuclearization was something North Korea periodically offered in generic form, but would never get down to brass tacks. To his credit, he walked away in Hanoi when he saw that there had to be extensive lifting of sanctions in exchange for very partial concessions. But then rather than return to a tough approach, he basically settled in to sort of collecting the PR benefits of the unprecedented summits and some partial limits on what North Korea would test with regard to intercontinental missiles and nuclear warheads, but they still went ahead with other systems. And he sort of settled into a gradual 2-year deterioration of the US and UN sanctions regime that now leaves us in a case where Kim Jong-un is doing better. He has some crises at home because of coronavirus, because of weather catastrophes that have damaged the harvest. But basically, it was a promise that slipped away. And then on Turkey, that's really been one of the worst areas in terms of what should have been done. There's an interesting background. Obviously, there's Trump Tower, Istanbul. The New York Times had a big article that still, stands well about how closely the Trump extended family and the Erdogan extended family participated in that project and made it happen. And it was successful financially, definitely for the president. I don't think it necessarily, influenced it. It's not that he was going to make money if he was nicer to Erdogan, but his just willingness to rely on Erdogan's advice and treating him as a legitimate partner is a very serious flaw. And I did a piece a while back with my colleague Aykan Erdemir, who leads our Turkey program, trying to say that, there's a sense that Erdogan, unlike Khamenei, unlike others, he dresses in a suit and tie, and they happen to be very, very expensive. It's actually, he was caught paying several $100s for his ties, but they're good quality stuff. I'm not going to ding him on the choice there. It's more that they don't realize that despite he maintains much more of the facade of democracy and moderation than others. But, the U.S. Treasury has had to impose sanctions on, not just Hamas, but also the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operating in Turkey. And Erdogan is very much a Muslim Brotherhood influenced ideologue working to promote that kind of Islamism across the region, including some very bad things in Syria, first helping radical insurgents, now beating up on our allies, the Kurds. And twice, Trump would take phone calls, and despite his advisors warning him not to treat Erdogan as a trustworthy interlocutor in any way, he just sort of does what Erdogan suggests and says, I'm pulling out. Happened to agree with Trump's own ideological predilection. But really across the board, it was a case where Trump really tried to interfere in Justice Department proceedings. You had Giuliani going in early on, representing parties in Turkey, trying to prevent penalties on its banks that evaded sanctions. So really one of the worst stories. And then I'll turn over to John Hanna on Russia.
Just quickly, Will, on Russia. I mean, it's one of those, I guess, many examples. It's one of the crazy themes that runs throughout the Trump administration is, on the one hand, you appear to have an administration policy toward Russia, which is actually quite tough, I think more hawkish than its predecessor, in terms of doing things like enhancing the U.S. Troop presence in Poland, or in the Black Sea, increasing defense cooperation with the Baltic states, with Ukraine, with Georgia, sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany, to try and deter European dependence on Russian gas. So you have all of these very, very positive things. Over 300 Russian entities over the course of 4 years sanctioned for violations of all kinds, from human rights to arms sales, to the hacking that occurred of the U.S. elections. But on the other hand, you have Trump and Trump's policy toward Russia, which was completely divergent and undermined so much of the good work being done to deter Russia by the broader administration. And it's, of course, Trump at Helsinki siding with Putin over his own intelligence community regarding the hack of the 2016 elections. It's Trump being absolutely silent when Navalny gets poisoned with a banned substance. When there's repression in Belarus and the Russians are supporting the dictator Lukashenko. It's just item after item where there's this.
Or most recently, the solar wind.
The solar wind.
Trump says, maybe China did it. When we all know
absolutely, the solar winds hack, where he can't bring himself to hold Russia to account. And as you and I and David know, who have all worked in government, it's good enough to have the administration all pulling in one direction. If you lack presidential leadership, much less have a president pulling in the opposite direction, it's very detrimental to actually conducting really good and effective policy and firing on all cylinders as the most powerful democracy in the world and the leader of the free world. So I think it's a very, very mixed bag with Russia, where there's ample room for the Biden administration to pick up the good, correct the bad, and Biden may be the right person to do that, assuming his head is in the right place with regard to Putin, and there's reason to believe it might be.
Yeah, and of course he was part of the previous administration that notoriously tried to do the Russia reset, and that didn't turn out too well. So I think he's probably once burned, twice shy there. All right. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time. Just a kind of final question from me. It's going to be a fairly open-ended one. If there's anything else you guys want to add here, but this has to do with the health of our national security institutions, and of course that can be the tools, the systems, the personnel, the international institutions. But obviously the Biden administration has taken office during a very challenging time. We all know the headline crises they're dealing with. But overall, would you set aside some of the crises du jour, do you think the Biden administration is actually going to be inheriting a relatively healthy set of national security institutions from the Trump team, or is it a pretty severely weakened and hollowed out set of institutions, and the Biden team will need to address that in addition to the policy challenges they face?
John, you want to start?
I'd simply say that, based on conversations with people who spent their entire careers at the State Department, at DOD, within the intelligence community, you do get the sense, Will, that these are badly damaged institutions that feel they've been undermined, attacked. The whole deep state narrative coming out of the administration, I think, has been deeply demoralizing for an awful lot of the permanent career civil servants that serve the country at often great personal cost and sacrifice. We all know that these institutions in changing times require serious reform, but the wrecking ball that I think the administration has taken to the national security establishment within the U.S. government, and really putting it up as an enemy to be opposed, rather than a critical tool in advancing American national interests around the world. My own sense of it from talking to a lot of people is there is a huge amount of rebuilding to be done. And that, of course, requires time, energy, thought, and at the end of the day, a lot of resources as well are going to have to be applied to this if we're going to be able to come back.
Mm-hmm. All right. David, anything to add to that?
No, I think that made the point quite well. If anything, just there's probably a lot of enthusiasm for a return to some of those institutions from people who are, Biden supporters, younger people who want to take the foreign service exam, or even more senior people who left and may look for an opportunity to return if there's a way to make that work bureaucratically. But it takes time, right? A first-year foreign service officer can't replace a departed ambassador. I think it's even tougher in the intelligence community. But I think there is a potential for revitalization.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, this is a wrap. Thank you to all our listeners. Once again, let me remind you, you can read the full report co-edited by David Adesnik and John Hanna, From Trump to Biden, The Way Forward for U.S. National Security, available at fdd.org. So David and John, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Great to see you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.